would like to ask you, Georgie, to go first and introduce yourself, and then Michael.
Okay, grand. So as Teresa has said, my name's Dr. Georgie Budd, just Georgie's fine. I've had sort of a bit of a rambling journey into mindfulness. When I was very young, I was brought up in a working class family. My nan, who I was very close to, had chronic illness, and she actually practiced mindfulness, although she wouldn't have called it that. She had a very sort of spiritual side to her. She herself was deeply Christian, but a lot of the practices that she went through were essentially built into our foundations of mindfulness. And so that's where I first learned how to meditate. Particularly, I had trouble sleeping as a kid. I was a very anxious kid. So going through sleep meditations with me was pretty much sort of how I grew up. And then I went on to medical school and had a difficult journey there, and ended up with some mental health problems. I went through quite a difficult sexual assault in my final year of med school, and it was the first time really that I'd had to engage with mental health services. Before, it had all been dealt with by my GP. And essentially what I was told, that despite what I had been through and despite what I had then tried to do to myself, I was not a bad enough case to warrant any counselling unless I wanted to go on a 9-month waiting list. And my family, being working class, we didn't really have the money to put me in private counselling. I was very fortunate that, you know, everyone sort of rallied around me and we found some funding to get me some help. Otherwise, I don't think I would be a doctor today. I don't think I would have made it through that last year. And that was quite a blow, really. I knew mental health services weren't good. My nan suffered with mental health problems due to her chronic illness. And so I started thinking about the access to these services and how bad is it out there for other people that didn't come from, although I was working class, the privilege that I had come into. And then I'm just going to share something very quickly. Oh no, host disabled participant screen sharing. Help me, T. Hopefully I'll be able to share something, but in my
Absolutely, go now.
Year out of medical school, this happened. I'm hoping you can all see that. But yeah, I'll take it down. It's not the nicest of images. But yeah, so my second year out of medical school, I was involved in that car crash and I was paralysed. And I spent 8 months in physical rehab in a hospital, and I had to find something to help me cope with this life change. And at the time I didn't realise it, but reflecting last year, which was 4 years after the accident, I realised a lot of what I did was based in mindfulness, being outside, being connected with nature, having those moments to just sit and reflect internally and sit with my emotions, most importantly, and what had happened to me. And that's how I ended up really getting involved with the mindfulness workplace community. During COVID, I was shielded. I felt very alone. I felt my progress had gone backwards, and it felt like being in that hospital again, that sense of isolation and oh my God, my life has just completely stopped and all my progress has gone. And that's when I found you guys, and it's been an excellent thing, helping me through that time, and has made me a real advocate for mindfulness and what it can do when you're going through difficult circumstances. So that's me in a nutshell. I hope that was more than 5 minutes.
Thank you, Georgie. Thank you for sharing some very vulnerable story, very sensitive information, and sharing the vulnerabilities that you went through. And we are privileged that you're here tonight, and privileged that you're here to speak. to us, to our community. So thank you very much. I'm going to come back to you, but for right now, I'm going to ask Michael to please share a little bit about yourself, Michael.
Thanks, Teresa, and thank you, Georgie. Really beautiful to hear that share. Firstly, hello, and I just want to thank everyone who's got their cameras on, because personally, it's so much nicer to see smiling faces rather than just like a sea of like black screens with white names. It just feels so unhuman. I like feeling like we're sitting around a campfire together, this little digital campfire. So it's a real pleasure to be here. And yeah, Teresa asked us to share up front about our journey into mindfulness. So in terms of my road into it, I would say that, like many of us, it came through my own mental health problems, the seeds of which were sown, I believe, before I was born. I believe that I inherited something ancestral, and the collective trauma of 2 world wars and everything that came before it. But I was born into a non-traditional family dynamic. My mum had been orphaned very young. Her parents were first-generation Irish immigrants and didn't have any support around her at all. And my father was a very wounded man, also had never had the opportunity to do any healing of his wounds. And his father was psychotic and a cruel man. And so I was born into this household where my father left when I was 2. My mum told him to go, which was probably the best thing he could have done for us. But then my mum, being a single mum, trying to raise 2 boys on a shoestring, she wasn't able to cope. And when I was 5, she had a nervous breakdown and had to move away. And at a time that's a really critical moment in child development. And she actually came back and worked her butt off for years to put a roof over our head and foods in our bellies, myself and my brother Paul. But because mum was so stressed, like many stressed mothers who are under-supported and overworked, there wasn't much bandwidth left over to attune to us emotionally. And so, like many emotionally neglected children, I turned to other means to get those needs met. And so at the time, it was flour and sugar. And yeah, unlike my girlfriend, I've got a metabolism where I actually put on weight. And being a fat kid in a culture where we're trained not just to fear fat, but to be disgusted by fat, that is a traumatic experience in and of itself. For my body to be considered less valuable than slim bodies. But the insidious thing about it was that the mythology surrounding fatness was that I was fat because of my own personal moral failure. And so that is also traumatic because one internalizes that. I internalized that identity as a failure. And it also means that it's all bets are off in terms of bullying. So the bullying was absolutely horrendous. Now, I grew up in a rough part of London, a place called Eltham, which was a famous white working class area. Lived on the Progress Estate, which was the area where Stephen Lawrence was murdered. And so, you know, a lot of my black mates would never want to come to my house unless there was a whole group of them. But that was also being in an environment that wasn't safe. And the first time I was held at knife point, I was 10 years old, which was just after seeing a film called Monsters, Inc. If anyone's ever seen that. That was also this process of internalizing a chronic feeling of unsafety. There's no physical safety, let alone psychological safety. And I went to a school that was a failing school. It was shut down and turned around shortly after I left. But I had to essentially toughen up. Now, I was actually ultimately a very sensitive boy, but I had to develop a new set of coping mechanisms. So I became this boy here. That's me in the middle there, doing my very, very best. I'm a bad man, don't mess with me face. And by the time I was this young man in 2007, I find this photo very striking because it really represents the image of myself that I wanted to portray to the world, the way in which I was managing other people's impressions of me. And me and my mates at that time, we didn't have any real guidance or mentorship, particularly as a boy. There was no male guidance around me. And we were kind of just learning from each other. And it was a time when sort of like 90s rap and grime culture was really coming to the fore, and knife crime. And the main way in which we socialized was through skunk, which is like a genetically modified cannabis, where the THC, which is the psychoactive, is bred up, and the CBD, which is the relaxant, is bred out. And so it's basically like smoking paranoia, right? And if you smoke that every day for years and years, which is what I did, and you're completely dissociated for your internal life. I didn't start feeling feelings until I was in my early 20s, mid 20s. I'd successfully engaged in what I would call psychic self-mutilation. So I'd severed myself from my emotional realm. So all of that sort of fear, guilt, hatred, trauma festered, and over time my mind got darker and darker and darker and darker until the whole thing came to a head in a psychotic episode when I was 19. And that was a very confronting experience. My mom came to collect me, and she took me out to the countryside to care for me, and I was just in this caravan, terrified of my own mind. And I remember everyone's gone to bed, and I was sitting on the couch in the caravan in this quiet with this sense of like, oh wow, I've lost my mind. Lost my mind. I can't believe it. I can't believe this has happened to me. And yeah, in no real meaningful way could I articulate the journey of restoring my mental health. There was a long, decade-long journey, and it was a journey that would bring me into contact with all different sorts of people, but key people who really supported me to heal, such as my therapist, who 5 years of weekly therapy, sort of untangling that yarn. And then one of my mentors, a guy called Robert Mitchell, who runs Bromley Mindfulness. He's a complete legend. He was in a biker gang, sort of giant hatchet scar down his face. See this massive dude, like with these tiny tingsha bells, like, and but he really supported me, and he taught me everything he knew about the mind. And over time, I was able to develop a new relationship with my mind. And I dedicated my life to mental health. I joined the charity Mind, those of you know Mind. Joined in frontline services in Southeast London, working with teenagers. Went on to co-create the UK's biggest peer-led mental resilience project. So that's run by people with lived experience rather than academic qualifications per se. And then went on to co-design Mind's national mental health strategy for schools. And during that time became interested in adult mental health because we were trying to get parents along to the school, because the whole school approach was a combination of interventions aimed at all members of the school community, whether you're a kid or a teacher or a parent or the bloody janitor, everyone. And getting parents along was hard. It's like, well, where are they all? It's like, they're all at work, right? And so that led me to found Tough Cookie, which is a mental resilience training company. And we have a curriculum that we developed called Mixed Mental Arts, which is a toolkit of techniques, which is very much grounded in mindfulness and contemplative practice. And while I was at Mind, I became the meditation teacher at two places. One was Facebook. I taught at all three of their London offices. And the other was a centre for young men in gangs. And so it was really interesting for me to kind of hone my craft with tech nerds and rude boys in the same week, and became really interested in how you really strip the teachings back in a way that made them accessible to what I call the folded arm brigade, to seduce people into a deeper experience of themselves without triggering their allergies. And that's something that I became really interested in. So that's as much as myself as I can squeeze into 5-6 minutes. But thank you for listening to my story. It's also worth naming that my mum is actually on this call. Big ups, mum. My mum's also been on a very deep meditation journey. And the whole thing sort of culminated in me and my mum doing family therapy together, which was just the most extraordinary journey of like really unpicking our lives and understanding her life context, and just, yeah, so extraordinary, such deep work. Meditation is not a replacement for therapy, that's for sure. No replacement for it. All right, over to you, Teresa.
Thank you very much, Michael, for sharing your story as well. And can I just say to Michael's mum, wait, is that you, Laura? Who's Michael's mum? Where's Michael's mum? Over there, Annette. Thank you for being here, Annette. And I've had several conversations with Michael now, and I just find him absolutely inspiring. So to hear Michael's journey and to hear your journey is, it just, honestly, I've got goosebumps, and I'm very grateful that you're here, and just a big shout out for the courage that you've shown to be here. So how they do, and how do, thank you for being here, all of you. Sorry, Laura, to say, was that you? Because I saw you nodding earlier, and I was like, oh, I wasn't sure.
I'm very happy to be his mum, but not that.
Oh, so would I. So there we go.
Trust me, you really, really don't.
Gosh, so I think if just everybody wants to sit for half a minute and just digest Georgie and Michael's story, and of course the story, it's not a story, it's your life, just what you've been through to be here, and just so grateful for your courage.
What's been so great as well, just before that, is connecting with Michael and finding, like, when we had that first call, like how many parallels there were between things that we'd gone through and why we're so passionate about this work with communities that are difficult to reach. That was, for me, was really beautiful getting this together. So thank you to you, Teresa, for getting this together.
Oh, thank you very much. So Georgie, seeing as we're with you now, we're always going with the flow. I'd like to, the topic is about, how do we engage harder to reach communities, and if you're able to just do a little bit of a deeper dive into your perspective of how you are engaging with your communities, people with disabilities, more people from working class backgrounds, your family, you've spoken about your family's friends, and just as sort of any kind of practical innovations or tips that you have found, any innovations that you've stumbled across, and your main challenges. And I think, these challenges are always good to share, and then in the breakout rooms we could potentially discuss whatever people want to discuss. But if you're able to name them, if you're able to, if you're not, don't worry. But if you could just share your perspective and experience of how to engage.
Yeah, I mean, it really is, I think it is a difficult one. The disability side of things is relatively new to me, but the chronic illness, started in childhood with my grandmother. And not just that, but, the health in my family isn't great. And there is, from my sort of met with my doctor's hat on, we've known for many years that there's a massive link between poor physical health and poor mental health, and that both of those are highly correlated with poverty. Whether it is that having a disability, now that I have one, I can appreciate that life is more expensive with a disability. There are so many hidden costs that you just don't even think about as an able-bodied person. Not only that, but there's barriers to work. Even if you're just chronically ill and you don't have a physical disability, even if you're mentally ill, there are so many barriers in the way that we conduct society to actually getting and keeping a job. you know, the time it takes to go to appointments, to pick up your medications, to even just get an appointment with your GP, to sort something that for you is a daily, like, necessary thing. It's not a once in a blue moon, oh, I need an appointment for my sore throat. It's daily things that you're trying to manage. And all of that can be a massive barrier to not just work, but engaging in your community in general, in getting outside your house. If you've got a physical disability, there's access issues. There's all kinds of things that if you haven't experienced that, you don't truly, you know, you can't really understand it. And so for me, the key to a lot of it is education and understanding and reaching out and having that conversation. And, you know, Michael's talked about trauma and, you know, I grew up with different traumas, but trauma really, I think, is the root of so much unhappiness and so much mental problem. There's also links with addiction and, you know, with really chronic bad health decisions as well, whether that's because their health literacy is poor, or whether it's because actually they're chronically stressed and so they need a coping mechanism that's easy, whether that's alcohol, whether that's smoking weed, whether that's just plain old smoking. You know, there is that element to it. And we also, as we're getting sort of more and more into not just mindfulness, but into looking at the mind-body link, we know that chronic stress is a massive factor to physical illness and mental illness. We know that it's there. And there is a big push, and I hope we are part of this, into restructuring our lives and societies to allow for us to be less stressed, to work in a way that is compatible with our lives, rather than, you know, this conveyor belt one size fits all model. And for me, that's really important, because, you know, as you say, T, I've talked about my dad a lot before. You know, white working class community, my dad's a scaffolder. My dad, I love him to death, but there are elements of that sort of masculine, I don't need to talk about my feelings, you know, I just go down the pub with my mates and have a few pints and it's all sorted. And, you know, the anger and the tension and the stress that he takes on. And at different times, he has engaged with certain mindfulness practices. He did Tai Chi for a while, but always that stress of paying the bills and putting food on the table and, you know, raising a family came back. And he would say, well, when have I got time, George? When have I got time to do this? When have I got time to prioritize my own mental health? I've just got to get on with it. And that's kind of the attitude I was raised with, was, you know, pull yourself together, get on with it. This is life. And actually coming to terms with and letting go myself of a lot of the guilt and expectation I felt to always be on that grind, has been revolutionary for me. And I think it is difficult to get that message across. Michael talked about the folded arm brigade, and I think there definitely is that. It's not just a male problem. There's girls involved in this too, and we talk about toxic masculinity, but I think both genders can have negative traits, and you can be a woman with a negative typical male trait. You know, I think that's completely possible. And I think challenging those attitudes is going to be key to moving it along. But we can't forget that poverty trap, and that time poverty trap, that always having to have another job to just keep things ticking over, to just provide. And I think, again, it's education, and it's looking at that and looking what we've got in our communities and starting from your community upwards. I think, you know, in terms of disability, because that's my other hat, there is actually, within the disabled and chronic illness community, there's a lot of resistance to mindfulness. lots of resistance. You know, I engage with a lot of disability advocates who regularly will post stuff about, you know, basically sod off telling me I need to be doing yoga. Yoga's not going to make my disease go away. And for me, again, that's an educational block. It's also a medical system failure, in that medical students and doctors are not taught enough about complementary therapies. They're not taught enough about toolkits, and they don't understand it. So when a chronic illness patient or a chronic pain patient comes to them and goes, hey, you know what, I'm in chronic pain, and they go, oh, well, the nice guidelines are, I'm not going to give you any painkillers, I'm going to prescribe mindfulness. And it's like, mindfulness can be a great tool, but in the same way that meditation is not, you know, akin to actual therapy and counseling, mindfulness is not the same as also treating the root cause of the problem. It crosses over at so many points, and that we need to start collaborating more. And then that educational push for, I'm not saying it's going to cure you, you know, mindfulness is not going to make me walk again, I know that, but it does help me deal with the things that crop up in my life. And I also think appreciating that it's not for everyone, but why don't you give it a try? And I think that's an important thing. And then the final thing is the access, and also the stigma, in the same way that people don't always, you know, have a lot of barriers to work as a disabled person. There's also barriers to getting involved in other things, because you get the stigma of, well, if you can do this, why can't you work? If you can go out and do this, well, why can't you be doing that at work? It is so wrong, but again, it's being an ally, and it's pushing back, and it's that educational thing, and it's having the conversation. It's asking disabled people, what do you need? What do you need from me in this mindfulness class? When I took my MBSR, the lead man was absolutely stumped, because of course you do a body scan and I can't feel half of my body, and he did not know what to tell me to do. And the thing is that I was like, don't worry, I'll figure it out, and if I have a bad experience, I'll feed it back to you, you know, we'll go through this together. And actually it was a beautiful experience, because I got to connect with a different feeling in my legs. It wasn't feeling my legs, but there was definitely a sensation there. But in the same way that we need mindfulness to be trauma sensitive, because that's a big thing in the chronic illness community as well, sitting with your bad experiences and knowing that it's also okay to stop if it's too uncomfortable. It's the same with physical sensations with the disabled community. If that isn't working, well, don't force yourself, you know. And sometimes those sensations when I do a body scan are too uncomfortable. They are borderline painful. And so I allow myself to step off and go, okay, that's enough of that for today. I'll try something else. But it's just having that conversation. I think that's me, Teresa. You're muted, Tim.
I'm on mute. Was it after 2 years of being on Zoom, I still do it. Thank you. We have got time for questions in between. I'm going to be asking the same question to Michael, but we've got time for questions. Jenny, you have your hand up. Please, can you unmute yourself?
I just, those were fantastic testimonies, Georgie and Michael. Michael, I've known and worked with in the past, but Georgie, really, really good to hear what you had to say and to learn from it. I just wanted really to flag up some real opportunities at the moment for change. One is that NICE, who give guidance that's really relevant in medical circles in the UK, but is also really respected internationally, is just changing its guidance on depression to bring in a much wider range of potential interventions to help people with their mental health. They've really seemed to have taken on what we as the Mindfulness Initiative were talking about in terms of a wider range of choices for people so they can choose what works for them. So I think that's a really good signal that will work in other parts of mental health as well. And also within the workplace guidance, that's another set of guidance that's out for consultation at the moment. They've said mindfulness is an evidence-based intervention along with CBT, one of the two things that work for individuals in the workplace. So that really helps or will help once they're finalised for people to get access to help in mindfulness and other areas, and will help overcome the price barrier that there's been for many communities to get help in this way. And also this is something that's a bit confidential, but seems to be out there. There's going to be a big new consultation and then a strategy on mental health. And that's looking much more widely at how to support people and the links across to inequalities, communities that don't get access at the moment, and also the links to physical health. So in 2022, we've got a lot of opportunities to bring our own and our group's experience into changing things that will influence a much wider range of people. So I just wanted to put that in there before we talked about what we share.
I think the medical community is definitely getting more aware of the benefits. We are still encountering some resistance, particularly within our own ranks. I mean, I don't want to speak too soon, Teresa, but I'm in the middle of a study at the moment. I'm a research assistant looking at a mindfulness-based intervention for medical students, because over a quarter of medical students suffer with anxiety and depression that is high functioning, and it is contributing to the burnout problem we have in the medical sphere. And I'm hopeful that when the results come out, I'll be back and giving you guys a talk on what we found. And I'm, you know, it's looking really promising so far, but hopefully things are starting to change. But it's still a very archaic profession, and we are still having pushback from very sort of structured and ancient ways of thinking, but it is coming, and I do appreciate that, and I'm hoping for even more improvement in the future. And I think things like this, things like the MWC, are what's going to push that forward.
Thank you, Jenny, for sharing you know, some updates with the guidelines. I do have a question, and it is about, you know, it's interesting you're talking, Georgie, about education, because education seems to underpin a lot of the different levels that we're talking about here. We're talking about education in underrepresented communities, but also education from the kind of who we think are the professionals who are kind of delivering this as well. So it's I'm not quite sure I formulated my question really, but it's that how do we, and I think you have given the answer, you know, it's one step at a time. You said, you know, your father, he's done Tai Chi, wonderful. It's not full-blown mindfulness, but it is. And I mean, whatever full-blown mindfulness is, it's being present Tai Chi, and I guess it's that kind of mindfulness has its own branding problem as well, doesn't it? But it's about being present, it's about connecting, and I guess that's the education as well.
And I mean, some people may not like what I'm about to say, but you know, I think Michael will be on the floor with me on this, is that I think Michael's got the right idea in training people that maybe aren't formally or have academic qualifications, because actually, in order to engage those hard to reach communities, they need people they can see that are like them. They need people they can relate to and feel that relate to them. You know, you don't want someone coming in when you've lived a really difficult circumstance. And even if you are the sort of open-minded individual that you can see everybody has their struggles, if you come from real hardship, it's very difficult to take that advice from someone who, in your eyes, looks like they had a silver spoon. And that's, you know, one of the things that I'm constantly saying to my student medics is, you have to be able to engage on a human level. You have to make the patient feel that you see them just as a fellow human being, and not as, well, I know more than you about this, and, you know, that paternalistic sort of route. And although, you know, obviously it's great to get the qualifications, and I'm not putting anybody off doing that. I myself am thinking about doing a master's in mindfulness CBT one day, but I also think there is a lot of room, and needs to be room made, for people to train in this that aren't from that kind of background, because I don't think you need to be.
It's taking those white lab coats off, isn't it, Georgie? And it's that common humanity. I am human too. In
language that people understand. You know, we can talk about the evidence all day, we can critically appraise and meta-analysis and all that, but at the end of the day, if people don't see what it's doing for them, if they don't understand the true value, then they're not going to stick with it. And like I said, I think Michael's work is really important, because I think we need to be putting people front and center who have lived these lives and are now using these tools, people that are relatable.
Very important point. Thank you, Georgie. And unless anyone has any kind of immediate questions, I think that actually feeds really nicely into Michael's work and Tough Cooking. And you just nipped off to the loo, Michael, at Georgie's very important point that she said, and Michael is going to completely agree with me on this. So over to you, Michael. See what you can do with that one. No, it's about that lived experience, Michael, and for your audience being able to resonate or connect with a person that is with them, as opposed to somebody who they see doesn't look anything like them, hasn't had any experience that they've experienced. So over to you, Michael. We'd love you to share your work with Tough Cookie, and in particular, you know, back to the question of engaging people from harder to reach communities, and any innovations and challenges that you've come across the way.
Yeah, it's a really important point. Georgie flags, ultimately connection is the recognition in another of something that I know in myself. And it's really important for us to be able to recognize our own story in the people around us, particularly those who are authority figures or holding the space. Which is why in Tough Cookie, with our trainers, we do have this massive emphasis on lived experience and holding that alongside theory building. So I want to start my musings on this topic by saying that I know nothing. I am crossing this river by feeling the pebbles underneath my feet, and I'm in no way an expert on this topic at all. So everything I'm going to share is just sort of from my own meandering experience, I suppose. But for me, I became interested in the silence around class about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. I was noticing in a lot of Facebook comment threads and groups and circles that I'm in, when oppression and power and privilege were being spoken about, that race, gender, and sexuality were being explicitly mentioned most of the time. And when those three things were being listed, I was curious about the fact that class was never being included at that sort of circle of awareness. And I became really curious about why that silence? Why silence around the class? Where is that coming from? I believe that particularly in Britain, the British class system is absolutely world famous. You know, for any of my European friends that come to sort of study and live here, they're struck by the class divide, you know, of Britain. So for me, it is a huge piece, right? Class, and I suppose I want to start by saying that, you know, class is a tricky thing to pin down, right? Because you've got sort of upwardly mobile, you know, Essex folk who've you know, done good. It's like working class boy done good sort of vibe, driving around in incredibly flashy cars, you know, have a huge amount of wealth, but are still culturally working class or would define themselves as that. You've also got the asset poor middle class, for example, like Generation Rent. You know, a lot of my friends who have had to really struggle throughout their 20s. And I felt very much in the thick of it with them, you know, just trying to make ends meet. And it's interesting. I've got a friend of mine who was at a gathering of people who work in the inner work field. And on the surface of it, everyone's kind of doing the same thing, right? They're running workshops around meditation and community building and these different pieces, kind of roughly the same demographic, roughly the same age. But what they did was they got everyone anonymously to list their assets. And it painted a very different picture as to where everyone was standing. And it's something we don't really talk about is our assets, but I found it really curious, you know, when I turned 30 and a lot of my friends turned 30 and got to the age where you're looking to start getting a house, and all of a sudden a lot of my friends were able to find a deposit, for example, very easily from their parents, for example. And so it's really interesting, this piece around class, which tends to be invisible, but is very much still a thing in the UK. And so I suppose when it comes to mindfulness, and we think about how we're disseminating the practices, there's kind of two ways of looking at it. Firstly, there's looking at the student experience, and then there's looking at the experience of working class teachers of mindfulness as well. And so first and foremost, even just showing up, right, to a mindfulness class, I mean, wellness is notoriously the preserve of the middle classes, right? And the average mindfulness class is likely to be predominantly middle-aged, middle-class white women. And when we think about the barriers to even showing up and what might cause me to self-select myself out of the space before even giving it a go, we need to think about who are the poster people for mindfulness. How many working class poster people are there for mindfulness, for example? Or even when you see it advertised, when you look at mindfulness practitioners' websites, it's always tends to be someone sort of a white, middle-aged, middle-class woman smiling into the sun, you know, receiving the heat of the glow on her face. And what happens is that it becomes ego dystonic. That is to say, incompatible with my self-image. Me doing mindfulness is incompatible with my self-image. And that's what we need to sort out, is we need to create images of mindfulness that become compatible with a working class person's self-image. But also, I suppose when it comes to like bettering the self, which there's a great comment I saw recently, which was, I can't remember what it was anyway, but bettering ourselves is very much this sort of this process of bettering the self is very much this preserve of middle class people. And I think that does come down to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? If you're still in survival mode, you have a different filtration system in terms of your salience landscape, like what is standing out to you as important. You're going to be operating at the security level. Right? I remember when Extinction Rebellion landed and I was trying to set up Tough Cookie, and I didn't really engage with it because I was like, need to like secure my income. I need to secure my security, my business. And that's how I justified it at the time. I maybe would have responded differently then, but I really noticed the class divide there in the sort of the meditation community in which I was moving in. And of course, Extinction Rebellion did get a lot of critique. Now, I suppose there's also a piece around class wariness, you know, when we look at things like Brexit, and the class divides that, you know, how that played out, and the notion that, well, it's the working class being dumb and voting against their interests. And I heard that over and over and over again, this idea of false consciousness, that if only they knew better, if only they were better educated, they would have voted differently. There's a deep, should we say, like a superiority inferiority dynamic there. It's not relational and equal. It's subtle superiority inferiority dynamics. And I believe that there is a class wariness of being spoken down to by middle class people, which unfortunately, a lot of the way people have learned to teach mindfulness can have these whispers of being patronizing. You know, there's almost that tired trope of talking to you like you're a 5-year-old. This sort of, and it is a tired stereotype, I think, that notion of the meditation teacher. But there is like the meditation voice, which not only is like coming as the meditation voice, but is also coming through a different accent, you know, a middle class accent, for example. And that can be triggering for people. It's triggering for a lot of my mates. And so there's also, I think, pieces around language, you know, and when I was working with these young lads who, you know, these are the sorts of guys who would like run up on you with a clown mask and a pistol, you know, they're serious guys. And what was really interesting is that, you know, if I asked them, were they anxious? They'd all be like, no, not anxious at all. But if I asked them, are they paranoid? They'd be like, oh yeah, so paranoid. And anxiety and paranoia are essentially what if scenarios. It's the reaction in the body to a vague, unspecified what if scenario. But it's interesting how the different framing has completely different levels of relatability. Yeah. Very much so in like when I grew up, paranoia was the word, right? And there's also this piece around just notice the thought. Notice that it's just a thought. Now, often, like some people are living in incredibly dangerous situations, council estates, for example, that have a very high crime level. They might have absolutely no psychological safety in their home. They might not have any physical safety. And so there's this piece to kind of hold, which is, I don't want to pathologize worry. I don't want to pathologize that, because that actually might be someone's response to a very direct and immediate scenario that they're inhabiting. And there's also pieces like, I remember taking some of these young men and giving them, they weren't Polaroid cameras, the disposable cameras you used to get from Boots. I don't know if you remember those, the wind-up ones. And I'd send them out and they had to take photos of something beautiful. Right, and they'd have to come back and they'd have to find what presented itself as beautiful, even if it wasn't pretty. But there was I just was looking around myself, and I was in Bermondsey. I was in an estate in Bermondsey, and I was just like, Jesus. I mean, yes, if you're a Zen master and you can perceive, you know, the beauty in any given moment and the inherent perfection, great. But if you're new to mindfulness and you're being told to like go on a mindful walk, and you live in a concrete jungle of hard edges and frowns, there's a piece there too, you know, that needs to be held, such as, where are people dwelling? I did lockdown very differently to my brother, you know, who's in a one-bed flat in South London. I moved to Devon, so I'm out in like epic wild nature. Way easier to be mindful when I'm in a redwood forest than when I'm in a busy high street. And I suppose there's also a piece around a community of practice. Like when you step into, as a working class person, into mindfulness as a domain, which is a middle class person's domain, there is a piece around you have to leave your roots behind. They get left at the door. And even though it's this funny dynamic where, because mindfulness and that whole world is very much the middle class domain, not very many working class people enter into it. It can feel alienating, because middle class people think that you belong to their world. Working class people believe that you belong to their world. But actually, you're now whistling to slightly different tunes because they're not on that path of inner inquiry that the practices give you. And so there's this kind of being between two worlds and not quite knowing where you are. You don't really belong to either world. It's a deep loneliness that can live there. Because ultimately you're not middle class. You have a different value system. You have a different lived experience system, a different reality of a different way of sort of interpreting the world. You know, even things like the critique that some of my friends in the mindfulness community have said, like, oh, you know, the whole piece around mindfulness and helping people stay in the rat race. You shouldn't go in and give someone an hour and a half talk as a one-off because that's helping them stay in the rat race. And it's just like, well, yeah, some people don't actually have the luxury of dropping out of the rat race. You know, some people, like my little sister, for example, half sister, on my dad's side, I had 3 kids. You know, and it's like, how do you get out of the rat race when you're trying to feed 3 children by yourself as a single mom? And so there's this piece around like recognizing different people's situations. And I have also found myself wondering, like, how does the knowledge that I'm going to inherit and enjoy my own house, for example, that will be handed down to me, or several £1,000s when I'm going to have a life-changing sum of money is going to hit me when I'm 45. How does that show up in the nervous system versus someone who's never going to get that? That's what I'm curious about, is what does someone's fundamental feeling of safety look and feel like when they have capital to rest on? I get that money isn't the be all and end all, but it does provide a layer of safety, right? It's at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so I wonder, like, how does that show up in the nervous system? What is the difference in someone's nervous system between someone who has that abundance to lean on, even if they are a poor artist, but whose parents are millionaires, like one of my close friends, for example, who's deep in the mindfulness world. And I suppose it's kind of on the flip side as well, I wonder how it is having a working class person from a disadvantaged background in a mindfulness class when, let's say, I'm from a middle class background. And I wonder whether that would make me scared to share my background, because I would worry that I would be seen as having an easier life and would trivialize my own journey, in compared to this person who's had it way, way harder, which is, of course, suffering is suffering. But we all long to have our depths witnessed and met, right, and acknowledged and seen. And sometimes I do, I feel sorry for many of my middle class friends who've operated in these spaces. Thank you, Alan. Having had that kind of an experience of like poo-pooing their own lived experience, right? And then there's a piece around sort of as a teacher. I've definitely noticed myself, like when I've taught in certain organizations, I've really toned down my accent. I've taught in hundreds of organizations now. And there'll be some organizations where I won't speak like this, right? I'll have my middle class voice on, and I'll call up the client. Oh, great. Yes, I'll get that over to you. I'll get the proposal over to you. Thank you very much. And that's legit how life is, right? I just will change my accent, and it's hiding a piece of what I am, and it's ultimately a shame wound. Guilt and shame are slightly different, right? Guilt is I did wrong. Shame is I am wrong. And it is toxic. And there's a deep shame piece, I think, for working class people. And even the way that we are subtly shamed. I remember someone who also works in this space, the mindfulness space, kind of made almost a joke, but making a point about the fact that I was running my company whilst wearing jogging bottoms. And he was like, jogging bottoms is depression consciousness. You shouldn't be wearing jogging bottoms. You should dress up better. It's like, I grew up in jogging bottoms. For me, that was just, it's not what I wear when I go for a run. It's just what I wear. And that got me in such a way that I decided that I'd start wearing joggers to Facebook. And so I was like teaching and in the Facebook offices, walking in my joggers, just to make a point, and a chain. Just because I could, and because I wanted to, because it was my own little act of rebellion in this middle class world that I have to navigate if I'm going to participate in mindfulness.
I resonate so much with that, Michael, myself, because from a working class community, being a doctor, like, it's getting better, but the amount of doctors that come from privilege and have no idea what things can be like on the other side. And I do the same as you. Sometimes I'm talking with like my consultant, and I'll know it's a new consultant that I don't know very well, and at first my voice is a bit posher, it's a bit more southern, and then I'll go into one of my clients who are from the Welsh Valleys, which is where I live, and I'll feel myself, you know, and it's not a case of dumbing down, it's not a case of masking, it's not a case of any of that, it's just, I want you to know that I understand, and so I put on kind of a different hat. And in the same way as that was your little act of rebellion, me in med school, I have plenty of visible tattoos. That did not go down well at first, because it just wasn't a thing that a doctor did. And, you know, these stereotypes, it's being challenged. It's finding someone that resonates with you, and that, you know, you can put yourself in that different situation. But we all do it. We all change up how we are for different audiences, so to speak. But it's going to be refreshing to have more people in the space that aren't your stereotypical.
Yeah, I think I mean, ultimately, again, coming back to the nervous system, what is going on in my nervous system when I'm surrounded by people who use the same vocabulary as me, who have the same accent as me? Not that accent is a reliable marker of class at all, by the way, but as a crude way. How does that show up in my nervous system when I'm in that space? Like, I know the rules of this game, versus someone who is in that space and people don't speak like them, people aren't using the same language as them, people aren't dressed like them. How does that show up in their nervous system? And so that's an open question, right? It's the same with this inheritance piece. That's also an open question. But yeah, ultimately, there was someone commented when I posted about this on LinkedIn, and he said, the class system, to my mind, is the key cultural stumbling block. The inbuilt prejudices are so ingrained that I often imagine that it would take post-apartheid truth and reconciliation processes to make the shift. And that last sentence was so powerful. The built-in prejudices are so ingrained that I often imagine that it might take post-apartheid truth and reconciliation. I don't know why I can't say this word. It's been a long day. Reconciliation processes to make the shift. And I think this is also a piece that needs to come up for teachers of mindfulness, which is there's been so many moments. Let's take Brexit, for example, or Trump coming to power, which were moments of the working class doing that, right, to a huge degree. One of the biggest predictors of someone voting Trump, for example, was how much political correctness they'd come into contact with recently, right? So I am left wondering, as a mindfulness practitioner, which is, okay, let's think about the shadow. Let's look at the unknown parts of ourselves. Are there any parts of me that hates and resents working class people? Right? There's a part of me that hates and resents working class people, right? And that's something that needs to be owned within each and every one of us. Otherwise, we're just like, oh, I'm just going about my life. And like, there is also a piece there that it's hard not to feel triggered by working class people, because different value systems lead to different politics, lead to different ways of living. So I think there's a piece there as well for teachers. I advised XR actually on how to train their spokespeople to honor and include the fact that they might actually hate mainstream people, for example. And how that plays out. So those are just my musings anyway.
And I think it's interesting because you talk about that like double-edged kind of sword thing of being in two worlds. And for me, you saying, you know, you kind of resent working class people. In some ways, I grew up resenting some of the middle class and rich people that I was around, because they didn't understand the struggle that I was seeing, not just in my own life, but in the people I was around. And I get like it with some of my fellow doctors, where I'm like, you don't see what these people are going, it's not as easy as what you're suggesting they do. And, you know, so I think that's right, is it's looking within ourselves and kind of owning that resentment and, you know, coming at both sides non-judgmentally, because it's no one's fault where they've grown up or what they've experienced personally, and the stereotypes and perceptions that they have of certain things if they don't know about it. It's the same as someone comes up to me without knowing about a disability issue or what language to use, or, you know, sometimes it's just ignorance, sometimes people are just horrible, sometimes it's just that they haven't experienced it, and it's having the conversation.
We had a webinar last week with Joey Webber on equanimity, and it was a really interesting session on we all have judgments, and so is mindfulness sort of one, you know, being no judgment. It's about noticing our judgments, going there, being aware of our judgments, and then dispelling them. So it's a really important point. But I'm gonna, so thank you very much, Michael, for that. I'm mindful of time, so we were going to break out into small groups, and I think it'd probably be really valuable if we still were able to do that, even if for 5 minutes. But I see that Angie has a question. So Angie, do you just want to unmute yourself now and ask your question? And yeah, we've got
me and the cat. Me and the cat will ask you a question. Yeah, it was about changing the landscape, really, of mindfulness. How can we make mindfulness courses, mindfulness training, more affordable to marginalised groups? I'm from a working class background in the Northeast. I'm on a very low income, and luckily my partner is able to bring in some income that's allowed me to do the mindfulness course, but that's not, and mindfulness training, which I did with Breathworks, but it's, and Breathworks is a foundation which enables people to train who are on a lower income. And I think the more affordable, the more accessible those courses, those training are, the more the landscape will change and allow people from marginalised groups to be able to become mindfulness teachers and shift things. And just wondered what other people's opinions were on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. I am wondering, Teresa, whether it would be worth putting people out into groups for, you know, even just 10 minutes, and then coming back for a 10-minute Q&A, just because I'm sure there's a lot in the that might have bubbled through, that it would be good for people to just have some sense-making time.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you, Michael. And I think maybe, Angie, that could be, you know, we'll capture your question, and it's in the chat, but it could be something that you know, comes up in a different frame. So really, I just wanted to pop you into small breakout rooms, and the question being, you know, what has this conversation revealed to you, and what thoughts do you have about this topic? And I think, you know, Angie, that, you know, this is a really useful point that you're making. So if you're happy for me to pop you into groups, oh, people dropping off the call. I hope that's not. Do people need to drop out? For whoever wants to say goodbye, quickly say goodbye, and then I'll put whoever's left in a group.
I'm teaching now, but thank you so much. It's been really amazing, inspiring to hear from both of you, Michael and Georgie, and really made me think about the power of stories and what it is to hear, you know, really hear, because often we don't really get that much time. You might get a little intro, you know, you get like a couple of sentences from someone, but actually this real, like this depth and this sinking into your stories, experiences, lived experience, and your particular backgrounds really, was just so wonderful and helpful. And I work particularly with communities of colour and also with LGBTQ plus communities, and there's just a lot that, you know, that are different things, but there, you know, there's been a lot in your sharing. And also I work for Mind as well, Michael, and Rainbow Mind is one of the kind of offshoots of Mind, and I know that there are other of the protected characteristics as well, especially like hearing some of the things you were talking about, Georgie, as well. Really makes me think about how can we be as you know, inclusive as we can in all regards, and the trauma, safety, and so on. Anyway, I'm going on, so I'm going to stop there. Off to go and teach.
Thank you very much. So we hope to stay in touch.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All the best. Thank you. Chris, I see your hand up. Can you wait till after the breakout rooms, or is it a burning question you'd like to ask now?
No, I'll wait. It was just a great session, but just some, lots of reflection, lots of stuff coming up, and I just wanted to just maybe share a couple of things, but I'll do it later. Fine.
Okay. All right. So literally just for 5 or 6 minutes, everybody, I'm going to pop you into a room. Michael and Georgie, would you like to go into a room, or would you like to have a break for a cup of, quick glass of water?
I'm going to nip to the loo. Yeah.
Okay. I'll put everybody else into a room just for 5 minutes. And the questions being, what has the conversation revealed to you? What thoughts do you have about the topic, and some sharing reflections? How can you contribute to bringing mindfulness into those who traditionally have not had access to it? So, just some ideas to give to you. Thank you, everybody, for sharing, and thank you all for coming back. I always want to thank people for coming back, because it's always like, oh, I'll just go now. So we have 4 minutes, so it's never enough time. But if anyone would like to be brave enough to share some of their conversations, or some of their insights, some of their reflections, now is the time to do it, and we'd love to hear from you. So thank you. Jenny, you've got your hand up.
I just wanted to ask Michael, because I know he's been working with community groups and some living with some very tough challenges, if there's anything from that he might bring to his learning that he'd share with us.
Gosh. Only that voluntary workers working in the community, or particularly community development workers, have just had the sharp end of the stick. And as mindfulness practitioners, we need to be supporting them, because they are the front line right now. We've had a government that's consistently underfunded, decimated community mental health services. So a lot of that is falling on voluntary workers and community support workers. So if you have capacity to be able to offer training and support to VCS workers, please do, because the suffering is deep and real. And aside from that, I'm actually in the process of putting together a report, but I actually haven't started disseminating all of the insights that I've gained. So if you had asked me that question on Friday late afternoon, Jenny, I would have had a lot more to say.
Thanks, Michael. Would anyone else like to share any insights, or ask Georgie or Michael any closing questions in the last 2 minutes?
Sorry,
I would just like to ask how we can connect, Michael, with what you guys are doing, because I think it's really important work you're doing, and how can we continue to connect with that conversation?
Well, my website, I've just put my website in the chat. Hit us up if you want to stay informed about our journeying and opportunities that are coming up with Tough Cookie as well. We're in the process of finding people to teach this work as well, to teach our mixed mental arts curriculum. We only hire people who have that lived experience piece of recovering from mental health problems or overcoming some form of major adversity. But thank you for being interested in connecting. I don't do social media or anything like that, apart from LinkedIn, the occasional post, but that's more for like lead generation and marketing than anything else. But thank you, Chris. Yeah, it's a great saying, it takes one to know one.
And just to add to Michael's previous point, I mean, I'm not a mindfulness teacher. I'm doing the work with medical students through another teacher. who came from Bangor University. But any of the teachers out there, if there are things you can get involved in your community to offer any kind of short form course or classes in general to, like, carers, informal carers, people like that, you know, it starts from the ground up, doesn't it? It starts in the communities that we are living in and making changes on that level. And hopefully, you know, the top down changes are coming, the big infrastructures are realizing the potential of all of this. But in such difficult times, and as an A&E doctor, you know, some of the stuff that I'm seeing come in, they don't have a support in the community right now. And if anything can be offered from your organizations, and I know some of you guys already do this, but informal carers and social supports are the people that are really taking the brunt of this right now.
Yeah.
And Georgie, we'd love to have you back when you have more information from your study, and maybe another collaboration between Tough Cookie and your study, Georgie. And nice, let's get the nice guidelines in here as well, Jenny. See what we can do. Let's do it all.
I think me and Mike bounce off each other for like ages.
And maybe just to speak to this final piece, like, thank you to all of you for choosing to be here on a Wednesday evening after what I'm sure has been a long day. And to that part of you that chose to be here, like, bless you and thank you, because we need class conscious mindfulness practitioners, so that we can move into that, like, we can honor and include class at the table of awareness. It will enable us to bring more impact in our work. Yeah, and I think, so thank you.
Can I just, one other thing I would like to say is, you know, my instinct is the reason you are here today is because the love of your mother, and I think, you know, Annette has got so much as a person, as a human being there. I think that's just hugely powerful, and I think it's that quality of love as well. I mean, we can talk about mindfulness, but it's that quality of love that, you know, that has helped, and you work together in, I think is where it all comes out to me as the main thing. So big hand to Annette.
Yeah, bless you, Chris. You're absolutely spot on. It's the only reason I'm here. Yeah.
And on that note, and a remarkable tribute to Annette, thank you for being here. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Georgie. And thank you to all of you. Thank you, Michael and Georgie, for sharing, as I said, your vulnerabilities, your sensitive backgrounds, and for trusting us with your experiences. It's a great honour. And thank you all for being here tonight. I hope to see you next week at our trainer sharing forum. So stay in touch and go well, everybody. Take very good care. If you want to unmute yourself and say goodbye, that would be lovely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Great night.
Thank you. Great session. Thank you, Teresa, for organising it.